I'm 83 years old, and I need to tell you something that's going to make you uncomfortable. For 67 years, I was alive, but I wasn't living. I was breathing, working, eating, sleeping, raising children, building a career, doing everything you're supposed to do. And I was absolutely, completely, devastatingly asleep the entire time. You think you know yourself. You think because you have preferences and opinions and habits that you're living an examined life. You're not. I wasn't. And the worst part? I had no idea. None. I thought I was doing just fine. My name is Margaret, and I wasted 2/3 of my life because I never stopped to ask myself 3 simple questions. Questions so obvious, so basic, that when I finally asked them at 67 years old, I wanted to scream. I wanted to go back and shake my younger self and say, wake up before it's too late. But I couldn't go back. None of us can. All I can do now is tell you what happened and hope to God you don't make the same mistake I did. It was April 2008. I was 67 years old. My husband Gerald had died 6 months earlier. 43 years of marriage, and then he was gone. Heart attack in the garden, face down in the tomato plants he'd been so proud of. The doctors said it was instant. They always say that. After the funeral, after the casseroles stopped coming, after everyone went back to their lives, I was alone in our house for the first time in 4 decades. And I mean truly alone. Our daughter, Rebecca, lived in Seattle. Our son, Thomas, had his own family in Boston. And I was in Milwaukee, in a 3-bedroom house that suddenly felt like a mausoleum. The first month after Gerald died, I did what I was supposed to do. I sorted through papers. I called the insurance company. I wrote thank you notes for the flowers and the food and the sympathy cards. I played the role of the dignified widow, the strong woman who holds it together for everyone else. I'd been playing roles my whole life. This was just another one. But then the tasks ran out. The paperwork was filed. The thank you notes were sent. And I was left with nothing but time and silence and a question I'd been avoiding my entire life. Now what? One night, I couldn't sleep. It was 2:47 a.m. I remember because I kept looking at the clock, watching the numbers change, feeling like time was slipping away from me even as it crawled. And I went downstairs and I opened a bottle of wine, Gerald's favorite Merlot that he'd been saving for our 44th anniversary. We never made it to 44. I sat at the kitchen table, drinking wine I wasn't supposed to drink, and I started thinking about my life. Really thinking about it for the first time ever. Not the highlights reel version I'd tell at parties. Not the sanitized story I'd constructed to make sense of my choices. The real version, the true one. And a question came to me, unbidden, unwelcome. What did I actually want? Not what did Gerald want. Not what my parents had wanted for me. Not what society expected. Not what a good mother should want, or what a responsible person should prioritize. What did I, Margaret Ellen Morrison, actually want from my life? And I couldn't answer it. I was 67 years old and I had no idea what I wanted. I'd never asked, not once, not ever. I started crying. Not the gentle tears I'd cried at Gerald's funeral. This was something else. This was grief for myself. For all those years, I'd sleepwalked through my own existence. I cried so hard, I threw up. I cried until the sun came up. And when I finally stopped, I knew something had broken open inside me. Something that could never be closed again. That morning, still wearing yesterday's clothes, eyes swollen, head pounding, I called my sister Linda. She was 64, living in Phoenix, retired from teaching. I asked her to come visit. I didn't tell her why. She arrived 3 days later. We sat on my back porch, and I asked her the same question I'd asked myself. Linda, what do you want? Not what you think you should want. What do you actually want? She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. What kind of question is that? Just answer it, I said. She started with the usual things. I want my kids to be happy. I want to stay healthy. I want... No, I interrupted her. Not what you want for other people. What do you want for yourself? What makes you come alive? She was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that broke my heart. I don't know, Maggie. Nobody's ever asked me that before. I've never asked myself. We were two old women who'd lived nearly 7 decades apiece, and neither of us knew what we wanted. We'd spent our entire lives responding to other people's needs, other people's expectations, other people's questions. We'd never asked our own. Linda stayed for 2 weeks. We talked for hours every day. We went through old photo albums. We remembered who we used to be before we became wives and mothers and the responsible ones. We cried a lot. We laughed more than I'd laughed in years. And slowly, I started to see the outline of something I'd buried so deep I'd forgotten it existed. Myself. That conversation changed everything, because I realized it wasn't enough to ask what I wanted. There were 2 other questions, equally important, equally terrifying. The second question came to me 3 weeks after Linda left. I was cleaning out Gerald's closet, a task I'd been avoiding. Every time I opened that door, the smell of his cologne would hit me and I'd close it again. But eventually, you run out of excuses. I found a box on the top shelf, shoved way in the back behind old sweaters and a broken tennis racket. Inside were journals, dozens of them. Gerald's journals from before we were married and from the early years of our relationship. I knew I shouldn't read them, but I did. And in those pages, I discovered a man I'd never known. Gerald had wanted to be a photographer, not as a hobby, as a life. He'd been good, really good. I found photographs tucked between the journal pages, black and white images of people and places I'd never seen. Street scenes from Chicago where he'd gone to college, portraits of strangers that somehow captured their entire souls, landscapes that made you feel the wind and the light. He had dreams of traveling, documenting different cultures, telling stories through images. He'd applied to graduate programs in photojournalism. He'd been accepted to 3 of them. But his father had insisted he get a real job, and so he'd become an accountant instead. He'd written about meeting me, about how much he loved me, but also about how marrying me meant giving up any possibility of that other life. He wrote, "I choose love over dreams. I hope that's the right choice. I hope I don't resent her for it someday." Did he resent me? I'll never know. He never said. He was a good husband, a kind man. He brought me coffee in bed every Sunday morning. He fixed things around the house without being asked. He was present at every school play and parent-teacher conference. But what if he'd been a shell just like me? What if we'd spent 43 years together, both pretending, both hiding our real selves, both dying slowly from the inside out? I found other things in those journals. He wrote about feeling trapped, about Sunday afternoons when he'd drive to the lake and just sit there, watching the light change on the water, wondering what his life would have been like if he'd chosen differently. He wrote about our 25th anniversary, how everyone had toasted to our happiness, and how he'd smiled and raised his glass and felt absolutely nothing. I sat on our bedroom floor surrounded by his journals, and I realized something devastating. I had loved Gerald, but I had never known Gerald, and he had never known me. We'd spent 43 years together, and we'd both been performing. We'd both been playing the roles assigned to us. Dutiful husband, supportive wife. We'd built a life together, but it was a life neither of us had actually chosen. That's when the second question hit me. Who was I before I became what everyone needed me to be? I was 67 years old, and I couldn't remember. I couldn't remember who Margaret was at 18 before I became Gerald's wife. Who was she at 12 before she became the good daughter who never caused trouble? Who was she at 5 before she learned that being quiet and compliant kept people happy? I started trying to remember. I went through old photos. I found my high school yearbook, read what my classmates had written. Margaret, you're going to do amazing things. Don't ever change. Stay wild. Wild. I hadn't been wild in 50 years. What happened to wild Margaret? I called my cousin Helen, who'd known me as a child. She was 71, living in Florida, sharp as ever. I asked her, what was I like before everything? What was I really like? She laughed. Maggie, you were a terror. You climbed trees and got in fights and asked questions that made adults uncomfortable. You once told Mrs. Henderson that her church hat looked like a dead bird. And why would anyone wear a dead bird on their head? You were fearless. Fearless. I tried to remember the last time I'd been fearless. I couldn't. What happened to you? Helen asked, and there was real sadness in her voice. I don't know, I said. I honestly don't know. But that was a lie. I did know. I knew exactly what had happened. Life happened. Expectations happened. I learned that fearless girls make people uncomfortable. I learned that questions get you labeled as difficult. I learned that wild women don't get chosen, don't get loved, don't get kept. And slowly, painfully, I started to unearth pieces of a person I'd buried so long ago I'd forgotten she existed. Little Margaret had loved to dance. Not ballet or anything structured, just moving to music, wild and free. I remembered dancing in the kitchen while my mother made dinner, spinning until I was dizzy, laughing at nothing. When did I stop dancing? Teenage Margaret had wanted to study architecture. She'd spend hours drawing buildings, imagining spaces, sketching impossible structures. I'd gotten accepted to a program at the University of Illinois. My father said architecture wasn't for women, that I'd just end up married anyway, that I should study teaching or nursing, something I could fall back on. So I studied elementary education. I never taught. I got married instead. Young adult Margaret had loved thunderstorms and staying up all night and asking questions that made people uncomfortable. She'd had opinions about everything. She'd argued with professors and challenged ideas and believed she could change the world. When had I stopped dancing? When had I decided architecture wasn't practical? When had I learned to be quiet, to be pleasant, to never rock the boat? I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. It had happened gradually, a slow erosion of self until there was nothing left but a reflection of what others expected. 1,000 small compromises. 1,000 times I'd bitten my tongue. 1,000 times I'd chosen peace over truth. I was so angry. Angry at my parents for raising me to be agreeable instead of authentic. Angry at Gerald for never asking who I really was. Angry at my children for needing me to be a certain way. Angry at every teacher and boss and friend who'd rewarded my compliance and punished my honesty. But mostly I was angry at myself. Because here's the truth. Nobody forced me to disappear. I chose it. Every single day for 67 years, I chose to be who they needed instead of who I was. I chose safety over truth. I chose approval over aliveness. Gerald didn't make me give up architecture. I gave it up. My children didn't make me stop dancing. I stopped. Every compromise, every silenced opinion, every killed dream. That was me. I did that. And I couldn't undo it. I couldn't get those 67 years back. but I could stop wasting whatever time I had left. The third question came 2 months later. I'd started making changes, small ones at first. I took a dance class at the community center, felt ridiculous among women 40 years younger, kept going anyway. I started drawing again, terrible amateur sketches of buildings I saw around Milwaukee, but they were mine. I said no to things I didn't want to do, and I stopped apologizing for it. I stopped going to church. I'd been going every Sunday for 40 years, not because I believed, but because it was what you did. The pastor called, concerned. I told him I was done performing faith I didn't feel. He was shocked. I didn't care. I stopped hosting Thanksgiving. For 30 years, I'd cooked for 15 people, spent days preparing food nobody appreciated, cleaned up while everyone watched football. That year, I told Rebecca and Thomas I wasn't doing it. Rebecca was furious. "Mom, Thanksgiving is at your house. It's tradition." "It's your tradition," I said. "It was never mine." "What's gotten into you?" she demanded. "I'm 67 years old," I said. "What's gotten into me is that I'm running out of time to be myself." My daughter Rebecca called one day upset. "Mom, you're different. You're not yourself." And I said, "Actually, sweetheart, I think I'm finally becoming myself. What you're noticing is that I'm not being who you needed me to be anymore." She didn't like that. We had a huge fight. She accused me of having some kind of breakdown, of dishonoring her father's memory, of being selfish. And maybe I was being selfish. But you know what? I was 67 years old. If not now, when? "You're not the mother I know," she said, and her voice was cold. "No," I agreed. "I'm not. The mother you know was a performance. I'm done performing." She hung up on me, didn't call back for weeks. That fight forced me to ask the third question. What am I willing to sacrifice to live as my true self? Because here's what nobody tells you. Finding yourself isn't the hard part. Living as yourself is the hard part. Because when you stop being who people need you to be, they get angry. They feel betrayed. They try to pull you back into the old pattern. Rebecca didn't speak to me for 8 months. 8 months. My own daughter, who I'd raised and sacrificed for and loved with everything I had, cut me out because I stopped performing the role she'd cast me in. I sat on our bedroom floor surrounded by his journals, and I realized something devastating. I had loved Gerald, but I had never known Gerald, and he had never known me. We'd spent 43 years together, and we'd both been performing. We'd both been playing the roles assigned to us. Dutiful husband, supportive wife. We'd built a life together, but it was a life neither of us had actually chosen. That's when the second question hit me. Who was I before I became what everyone needed me to be? It nearly broke me. There were nights I almost called her, almost apologized, almost went back to being old Margaret just to have my daughter back. But I didn't. Because I'd tasted freedom, and I couldn't untaste it. Thomas was different. He came to visit, sat me down, said, "Mom, I don't understand what you're going through, but I can see you're happier. That's enough for me." "Really?" I asked. "Really," he said. "Dad's gone. You've spent your whole life taking care of everyone else. If you want to be selfish now, be selfish. You've earned it," I cried. Because Thomas was giving me permission I didn't know I needed. Permission to choose myself. I started traveling. Nothing crazy, not at first. I went to Santa Fe, took a photography workshop, Gerald's unlived dream becoming my adventure. I was terrible at it. My photos were boring and badly composed. But I kept his camera, and I kept shooting, and it felt like honoring both of us, the people we could have been. I went to Chicago, spent 3 days just walking and sketching buildings. I stood in front of structures I'd only seen in textbooks, and I imagined designing them. I imagined the life I could have had if I'd been braver at 20. I went to New Orleans, danced in the street during a second line parade, and didn't care who was watching. People stared at the old white woman dancing like she'd lost her mind. I had lost my mind. The old mind, the careful mind, the fearful mind. Good riddance. At 69, I sold the house in Milwaukee. Rebecca was furious. "That's our family home," she said. "No," I told her. "It's a building full of ghosts and should-haves. I'm not haunting it anymore." But it wasn't. It was a building full of ghosts and should-haves. Ghosts of the person I'd pretended to be. Should-haves of all the conversations Gerald and I never had. I moved to Asheville, North Carolina, to a tiny apartment with big windows and exposed brick. I could see the mountains from my living room. Friends from Milwaukee were horrified. "You don't know anyone there," they said. "Exactly," I said. "Nobody there knows who I'm supposed to be." At 70, I took a woodworking class. I built a bookshelf. It was crooked and amateur, and I loved it. I built a table. I built a chair. I filled my apartment with furniture I'd made with my own hands. At 71, I met Helen. Not my cousin Helen, a different Helen. She was 68, a retired engineer, funny and sharp and completely herself in a way I was just learning to be. We met at a pottery class. She made a bowl that looked like a drunk octopus. I made something that might have been a vase. We both laughed at our terrible art and went for coffee after class. We became friends. We'd meet for breakfast every Tuesday. We'd go to art galleries and farmers markets and concerts in the park. And somewhere along the way, I realized I was falling in love with her. This terrified me. I'd been married to a man for 43 years. I'd never questioned my sexuality. I'd never even thought about it. But here's what I learned. When you spend your whole life being who you're supposed to be, you have no idea who you actually are. Maybe I'd always been attracted to women and I'd buried it so deep I couldn't see it. Maybe it was specific to Helen. Maybe sexuality is more fluid than I'd been taught to believe. I don't know. What I know is that loving her felt like the first honest thing I'd done in 7 decades. I told her how I felt on a Wednesday afternoon. We were sitting on her porch, drinking iced tea, and I just said it. "Helen, I think I'm in love with you." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank God. I've been in love with you for months." We had 6 years together before she died. Brain aneurysm, sudden, the way these things always are. She was teaching a pottery class 1 minute, on the floor the next. Gone before the ambulance arrived. And you'd think I'd regret it, right? 6 years versus a lifetime of safety and approval? But I don't. Those 6 years with Helen were more real than all my years with Gerald. I'm sorry if that sounds cruel. It's just true. With Gerald, I performed. With Helen, I existed. She knew me. The real me. The messy, angry, confused, broken open me. And she loved that person. Not the idea of me. Not the role I played. Me. When Helen died, I thought I'd go back to Milwaukee. I thought I'd need my kids, need familiarity, need safety. But I stayed in Asheville because Helen had taught me something Gerald never could, that I could survive anything if I was myself while I did it. Rebecca eventually came around. She visited me in Asheville when I was 74. We sat in my crooked apartment full of furniture I'd built and art I'd made, and she looked around and said, "Mom, who are you?" And I said, "I'm still figuring that out. But I'm finally asking the question." We had a long, hard conversation. I told her about the 3 questions. I told her about Gerald's journals. I told her about Helen. She cried, I cried, and she said something I'll never forget. "Mom, I'm 42 years old, and I don't know what I want either. I've been so busy being a good wife and mother and daughter that I never asked." "Then ask now," I told her. "It's not too late. It's never too late." "But what if the answer costs me everything?" she asked. "What if not asking costs you yourself?" I said. Rebecca went home to Seattle. 3 months later, she called me. "Mom, I asked myself what I wanted, and the answer terrified me." "Tell me," I said. "I don't want to be married to David anymore." I haven't wanted to be married to him for 10 years. And I want to go back to school. I want to study environmental science. I wanted to do that at 19, but I thought it wasn't practical. So I studied business instead. I've wasted 23 years. You haven't wasted them, I said. You've lived them, and now you get to live differently. She got divorced. David was devastated. Her kids were angry. Her friends told her she was making a mistake. She did it anyway. At 76, I started writing. Not well, not for publication, just putting words on paper about all the years I'd lost and all the ways I'd found myself. I wrote about Gerald and Helen and Rebecca and Thomas. I wrote about dancing in New Orleans and building crooked furniture and asking the 3 questions that changed everything. At 78, I had a mild stroke. I recovered mostly, but it was a warning. Time was running out. At 80, I took a trip I'd been planning for 2 years. I went to Greece, to the islands, alone. I swam in water so blue it hurt. I ate food I couldn't pronounce. I talked to strangers who became friends for an afternoon. I felt alive in every cell of my body. I'm 83 now. Helen's been gone for 6 years. Rebecca lives in Portland now, divorced, in her 2nd year of a master's program in environmental science, dating a woman named Sarah who makes her laugh. Thomas calls every week. His marriage is struggling because he finally told his wife he's not happy, hasn't been for years, and they're trying to figure out what that means. He's 55 years old and just now asking himself what he wants. My life didn't start until I was 67. Think about that. 67 years of sleepwalking. 67 years of being pleasant and appropriate and responsible. 67 years of never once asking, what do I want? Who am I really? What am I willing to sacrifice for truth? And here's what kills me. I was considered successful. I had a good marriage, healthy kids, financial security, friends, a nice house. By every external measure, I'd done life right. But inside, I was dead, hollowed out, a shell of a person going through motions. How many of you are doing the same thing right now? How many of you have built lives that look perfect on paper while your real self suffocates underneath? You're sitting there thinking, this doesn't apply to you. You're thinking you're living your life, making your choices, being yourself. But are you? Really? When was the last time you did something just because you wanted to, not because it was expected or responsible or smart? When was the last time you said what you actually thought instead of what would keep the peace? When was the last time you asked yourself who you'd be if nobody was watching? I look at young people now, people in their 20s and 30s, and I see the same pattern, different details, same trap. You're performing, you're curating, you're building a life that looks good on Instagram while your real self suffocates underneath. You're grinding at jobs you hate because you're supposed to build a career. You're staying in relationships that drain you because you're supposed to make it work. You're spending money you don't have on things you don't want to impress people you don't like. You're saying yes when you mean no. You're smiling when you're screaming inside. And you tell yourself you'll live authentically later. After you get the promotion. After you pay off the debt. After the kids are grown. After you retire. Later, always later. But later is a lie. I was going to live differently after the kids left home. Then after Gerald retired. Then after. And then Gerald was dead, and I was 67, and I'd wasted an entire lifetime waiting for permission to be myself. Nobody's going to give you permission. Not your parents, not your partner, not your children, not society. You have to give it to yourself, and it will cost you. It will cost you relationships, approval, security, comfort. Some people will hate you for it. Some people will leave you for it. Rebecca didn't talk to me for 8 months. Friends from Milwaukee stopped calling. People at church whispered about me. My brother told me I was having a mental breakdown. My mother, in one of our last conversations before she died, said I was embarrassing the family. But you know what the alternative costs? Everything. It costs you your one chance at an authentic life. It costs you ever knowing who you really are. It costs you dying with your music still inside you, your dances undanced, your truth unspoken. I have maybe 5 years left, maybe 10 if I'm lucky. My body is wearing out. I can feel it. Some days my hands shake too much to draw. Some days I'm too tired to leave the apartment. But these last 16 years since I asked those 3 questions, they've been more alive than all the previous 67 combined. I've made art that nobody likes. I've traveled to places that scared me. I've loved in ways that confused me. I've disappointed people. I've been selfish. I've been honest. And I've been myself. Finally, myself. Last week, my great niece came to visit. She's 28. Beautiful, smart, working a corporate job she hates, engaged to a man she's not sure about. We were having tea, and she said, "Aunt Maggie, how did you know? How did you know to change your life?" And I said, "I didn't know. I just couldn't stand not knowing anymore." She started crying. "I'm so unhappy, but I don't know what to do. Everyone expects me to marry Jason. I've already sent the invitations. And my job pays well. And I should be grateful. Everyone tells me I should be grateful. Are you grateful?" I asked. "No," she whispered. "I'm dying inside." "Then stop dying," I said. "Ask yourself the questions." "What if I lose everything?" she said. "What if you lose yourself?" I said. She left that day without deciding anything. But she called me yesterday. She'd broken off the engagement. She'd quit her job. She was terrified and free and alive. "What do I do now?" she asked. "Now you ask yourself what you want," I said, "and then you listen to the answer. Here's what I need you to understand. Those 3 questions are waiting for you. They'll wait until you're 67 like me. They'll wait until you're 75 or 82 or on your deathbed. Or you can ask them now. What do you want? Not what you should want. What you actually want. And I mean want, not need. I'm not talking about wanting financial security or health or general happiness. I'm talking about the specific desires of your specific soul. What makes you feel alive? What would you do if nobody ever knew? What did you love before you learned to be practical? Close your eyes right now. Think back to when you were 8 years old. What did you love? What made time disappear? What did you do just because it made you happy, not because anyone told you to? I loved building things. I loved creating spaces. I loved imagining structures that didn't exist yet. That 8-year-old knew what I wanted to be. She knew, and I ignored her for 59 years. Who were you before you became what everyone needed you to be? Before you learned to perform, to please, to shrink yourself to fit? There's a real person under there, I promise you. They're buried, but they're not dead. Not yet. Who are they? What did they love? What did they dream about? What parts of yourself did you kill to survive? Think about the last time you felt truly yourself. Not performing, not managing impressions, not playing a role. Just you, raw and real. When was it? What were you doing? Who were you with? That's your compass. That's pointing you toward who you really are. What are you willing to sacrifice to live as your true self? Because this is the question that matters most. You can know what you want. You can know who you are. But if you're not willing to pay the cost of living that truth, you'll still die having never really lived. And the cost is high. It might be your marriage. It might be your career. It might be your family's approval. It might be your comfortable, safe, predictable life. It might be the respect of people who only respected the mask you were wearing anyway. Are you willing to pay it? I paid it at 67, and it was worth every penny, worth every lost relationship, every shocked face, every disappointed comment, worth all of it. But oh God, what I wouldn't give to have paid it at 27, or 37, or 47, what I wouldn't give to have had those extra decades of real life. You think you have time. You think you'll figure it out eventually. You think there's no rush. But I'm 83 years old and I'm telling you the truth. You don't have time. None of us do. Every day you spend being who you're supposed to be instead of who you are is a day you never get back. Gerald died at 67. He never got to ask the questions. He never got to be the photographer he wanted to be. He never got to travel to the places he dreamed about. He played it safe his entire life. And then he died in the garden, his dreams still locked in journals on a closet shelf. Don't be Gerald. Don't be old Margaret. Don't be the person who wakes up at 67 and realizes they've never actually lived. Stop reading this. Right now, get a piece of paper. Write down those 3 questions. Sit with them. Really sit with them. Don't rush to answer. Don't give me the answers you think you're supposed to give.